There is a damaged clay tablet copied by temple scribes after Ur fell that should not exist as a text type. Not because it is forged, it isn't, because of what it records. Scholars classify Sumerian lament texts as theological poetry, ritual grief for destroyed cities, divine punishment, the standard vocabulary of ancient catastrophe. This tablet uses that vocabulary, but its structure is different. It does not lament one city, it lists 7, each ending different, not as poetic variation, as distinct physical signatures. The question this clay has carried for 4,000 years, unanswered, is this metaphor or memory? I found this because I was looking for something else. I was tracing the scribal transmission of Sumerian King List traditions, specifically how administrative records survived the collapse of Ur III and which institutions took custody of which texts, and the deeper I went into the post-collapse scribal record, the more I kept running into the same problem. The survival pattern didn't quite make sense. Not all of it. Most of it did. But there were texts that had been preserved by communities that shouldn't, by rights, have had access to them. And one of those texts was this. The city of Ur fell in approximately 2004 BCE, not to a single enemy, not to a single night of burning, but to a coalition of forces, the Elamites pressing from the east, the Amorites from the west, and to something the Sumerians themselves described in terms that scholars have spent a century arguing about. The administrative record stopped. The great ziggurat, centre of religious and civic life for generations, went quiet. The scribes who had maintained the most sophisticated record-keeping system in the ancient world packed what they could carry and left, or stayed and watched the city collapse around them. What happened to the texts in those final months is exactly where this investigation starts, and where it gets complicated. The Sumerians had been writing on clay for nearly 2,000 years by the time Ur fell. Their archival tradition was not casual, it was institutional, hierarchical, and obsessive. Temple scribes maintained inventories of grain, cattle, textiles, land transactions, but also something rarer, literary archives, collections of hymns, king lists, mythological narratives, lament texts that trace the theological understanding of why cities rose and fell. Losing these was not administrative failure, it was cosmological catastrophe. So they copied. In the years immediately following Ur's collapse, scribal communities at Nippur and surviving centres undertook systematic copying of texts that existed only in damaged or endangered originals. This is how ancient Mesopotamian literature survived at all, not because the originals lasted, but because someone, in the middle of a collapse, decided the words were worth preserving. The Lament for Urim is one of those preserved texts. Scholars place its composition in the period immediately following the fall of Ur III, likely between 2000 and 1900 BCE. It describes the destruction of the city in language that reads, even in translation, as viscerally physical. The storm that struck Ur is described as blazing like fire, as something that completely destroyed the city. The text names Enlil as having turned against Ur, having decreed its destruction, having sent a force that swept through streets and left the city silent. Enlil's storm was one that no one could escape. It moved not like an army, but like something that consumed the air itself. There is nothing unusual about the Lament for Urim read in isolation. Every convention of the genre is present. Scholars classify this as divine punishment theology, and they're right to. The Sumerians explained political collapse through the framework of divine abandonment, a god withdrawing protection, allowing enemies to destroy what the deity once sheltered, or in some texts, directly sending the destructive force. This is standard ancient Near Eastern theological reasoning, and the Lament for Urim fits cleanly within it. The Lament for Sumer and Urim covers broader ground. It doesn't mourn one city, but documents devastation roaring over the entire land like a great storm, a force that struck multiple cities in sequence, Eridu in the south, Nippur in the north. The same storm imagery, the same divine agency, the same sense of a force that moved faster than any human response could address. Taken together, these two texts document a catastrophe that was not local. Whatever destroyed Ur touched, according to the scribes who preserved these words, nearly every major city in Sumer. The Sumerian King List adds a structural frame. It is not a lament. It is an administrative document, a record of dynasties, cities that held kingship, and the lengths of their reigns. It reads in the early sections like mythology. Kings who reigned for tens of thousands of years, a period before the flood swept over, and then the continuation of kingship afterward with more plausible numbers. What the King List does quietly, without commentary or explanation, is record cities that appear once and then never appear again. A city holds kingship. Kingship is carried elsewhere. The first city vanishes from the record entirely. No explanation, no note of destruction. Simply, it was, and then it was not. What was it? What happened to the cities that appear once in the King List and disappear without a named enemy, a named event, a named reason? This is where the damaged tablet enters, and this is where I stopped being able to let go of this question. The tablet belongs to the tradition of texts copied in the scribal schools of the post-Earthly period, the same tradition that preserved the Lament texts, the King List, and the great mythological narratives. It is damaged in the way many tablets from this period are damaged. Sections worn smooth, marks faded past legibility, one corner missing. The scribes who copied it, working from an original already in poor condition, noted in a marginal notation that the source document was old. How old, the notation does not specify. What the readable portions contain is not a theological lament in the standard sense. The structure is different. Where the lament for Urim follows a poetic form, repeated invocations, divine addresses, descriptions of weeping, this text appears to enumerate. It lists, city after city, with a short notation after each name describing how that city ended. The scholarly category for this kind of text is uncertain, because it doesn't fit cleanly into any established Sumerian literary genre. It shares vocabulary with the lament tradition. But its structure is closer to an inventory, and the endings it records are not the same. This is the detail that the standard theological framing cannot comfortably account for. If a scribe were composing a ritual lament to explain political collapse as divine punishment, the destruction described would follow a consistent metaphor. The same storm, the same divine force. That is how the genre works. But this tablet describes 7 cities and assigns each a different ending. Physically different, non-interchangeable. One involves fire from the sky, another involves a wind that emptied the city of people, another involves burial, another involves water, another involves sand, another involves the wells, and one city is listed without any description of its ending at all. Let me explain what I mean when I say these endings are physically distinct. Standard Sumerian lament literature uses destruction language as theological categories, not physical descriptions. Enlil's storm is a concept, not a meteorological event. That is what makes this tablet different. Each city receives a different notation, and the differences aren't stylistic. The first city is the one the tablet calls struck by fire from the sky. The Sumerian phrase used here shares vocabulary with the lament texts, language describing heat, descent, and consumption from above. But the specific compound is not the standard metaphor for siege fire or domestic hearth fire. It is directional. The fire in this notation comes from above. What the tablet records next is the condition of the city afterward. The brick is described as changed, transformed in a way the scribe considered distinct from normal construction material. The word relates to a surface hardening that differs from ordinary fired brick. In the Sumerian material vocabulary, this was a technical distinction, not a rhetorical one. Scribes applied the same precision to building materials as they did to grain inventories. Whatever struck the first city left the material of the city itself, altered in a way that required a new word to describe. The second city is the one the tablet describes as emptied by an evil wind. The lament for Urim uses this same phrase, evil wind, and the Sumerian scholarship around it has generated considerable debate. The lament describes a wind that made the city like a city that has been destroyed, that drove people out before killing them, that left streets silent rather than filled with bodies. The tablet notation for the second city mirrors this structure. The city was not burned, not flooded, not buried. It was emptied. The word for emptied in this context carries a connotation of displacement rather than death. The people left, or were driven to leave. Whether they chose to go, or were forced by something they could not remain near, the notation does not specify. What remained, the text implies, was intact walls surrounding silence. The third city was buried in ash. The tablet uses a term here that appears in other Sumerian texts in contexts related to the residue of fire. Fine particulate matter, grey material, the the remains of burning. But the notation for the third city does not describe burning. The city was buried. The ash arrived from outside, from above, and covered it. The text does not indicate a source. The notation records only the condition. The city is beneath, and the notation ends. No survivors mentioned, no evacuation recorded, simply the city and then the material above it. The fourth city was taken by floodwater. Flood memory runs deep in the Sumerian record. The King List describes a period before the flood swept over, treating inundation as a civilizational dividing line. The Sumerian flood narrative describes water rising over days and remaining for weeks, and Mesopotamian cities were built on tells, artificial mounds of previous ruins, precisely because inundation had happened before. The notation for the fourth city is brief but specific. The water came, the city was covered, and the water did not recede the way seasonal floods recede. The city did not resurface. The fifth city was swallowed by sand. This notation is among the most physically precise entries in the tablet. The word for sand here is specific to fine windborne material, associated with desert advance rather than riverine silt. The city described was not on the Mesopotamian floodplain. The notation implies a location toward the western or southwestern edge of the agricultural zone, where the desert margin met settled land. What the tablet records is not a storm but a process. The sand came gradually and then faster, and then the city was beneath it. The surrounding land became desert. The walls became dunes. This is the only ending in the tablet that implies a gradual process rather than a sudden event. The others record things that struck. The sand notation records something that continued. The sixth city is the one where the wells turned bitter. Here is what I keep coming back to with this notation. The other 5 endings, skyfire, evil wind, ash, flood, sand, can be read, with enough interpretive flexibility, as metaphors for divine punishment rendered in physical terms. Bitter wells is a specific mechanism. It is not destruction from above or from outside. It is contamination from within the infrastructure that sustained the city. The water became undrinkable. The notation does not describe a military attack, a storm, or any divine force. It describes a city that was structurally intact but no longer survivable. People could not stay, the city did not fall, it was left. And then the seventh city. The seventh notation does not describe an ending. It preserves a name, that is all. The name is written, and after it, in the space where every other city's notation appears, there is either damage to the tablet or a deliberate blank. The scholars who have worked with this text have not reached agreement on which interpretation the physical evidence supports. What follows the name is a single word that translates approximately as warning, or as something belonging to the semantic category of things preserved specifically, so they will not be forgotten. The scribes who copied this tablet chose to include the seventh city. They preserved its name. They did not describe what happened to it. Why? Why preserve a name without an explanation? Why include a city whose ending you will not or cannot describe? Why is the warning there if the content of the warning is absent? This is not how lamentation literature works. The purpose of the lament genre is to describe the destruction, to name it, to give it theological meaning, to explain the mechanism of divine abandonment. Other cities in the tradition receive the same form, naming, description, theological accounting. The Lament for Urim devotes hundreds of lines to the specifics of what struck ear. Silence is not the standard form, elaboration is. But the seventh city has no elaboration. It has only a name and a word that means something like, remember this. The question the tablet raises, and does not answer, is whether the absence is protective or factual. Did the scribes omit the seventh city's ending because the description was too dangerous to preserve? Because the original was already damaged beyond recovery at that point? Or because the ending of the seventh city was so unlike the other 6 that no notation in the available scribal vocabulary could account for it? The tablet does not resolve this. What remains is the name, the blank space, and the instruction to remember. 6 cities, 6 different physical endings. 1 city with only a name and a warning. That is the complete record the scribes chose to preserve. The scholarly consensus on the Sumerian lament texts is not unreasonable. Ancient Near Eastern civilizations explained political catastrophe through theology. When a city fell, the interpretation was that the city's patron deity had withdrawn protection, had been offended, or had been overruled by higher divine authority. This framework is consistent across Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Hittite, and Canaanite traditions. It is how people processed what happened when kingdoms fell. The Lament texts fit this framework. The Lament for Urim was almost certainly composed for liturgical use, recited as part of temple ritual during the period of recovery after Ur's fall. The theology it expresses, Enlil sending the storm, An and Enlil decreeing the destruction, is consistent with every other text from this tradition. A scholar working within the standard interpretive framework looks at the Lament texts and sees exactly what the framework predicts: ritual grief, theological explanation, political poetry. The tablet with 7 notations is harder to account for within that framework. The difficulty is not the genre, the difficulty is the specificity. Theological lament operates through repetition and parallelism. The same divine force strikes multiple cities in the same texts. The wind is not 7 different winds. The fire is not 7 different fires. The theological vocabulary of Mesopotamian disaster literature is built on consistency of mechanism. The point is that the same God, acting through the same storm or the same divine decree, destroys everything. That is what makes it theologically coherent. One God, one force, many victims. But the tablet records 7 different mechanisms, and the differences between them are not poetic variation. They are physically distinct categories. Vitrified brick and ash burial and floodwater and sand and contaminated wells are not synonyms. They are not interchangeable. A scribe composing ritual theology in the standard tradition would not vary the mechanism. The variation in this tablet is either a dramatic departure from every known convention of the genre, or it is recording something that actually happened differently in different places. This is where I have to be precise about what I'm claiming, and where the archaeological record becomes relevant. I'm not claiming a direct correspondence between any notation and any excavated site. What I am claiming is narrower and harder to dismiss. The physical categories this tablet uses are not invented. They describe phenomena that exist in the archaeological record of exactly the period the tablet appears to address. Across the ancient Near East, excavators have documented physical anomalies at settlement sites that align, with varying degrees of precision, to the destruction categories the tablet describes. At several Mesopotamian sites from the late 3rd millennium BCE, excavation reports note layers of burned material that do not correspond to known military destruction events. The standard diagnostic for military destruction is a destruction layer combined with evidence of rapid abandonment, arrowheads, unburied bodies, weapons, signs of conflict. What some sites show instead is fire evidence without the military signature. The burning happened. The markers of siege or assault are absent. At other sites, excavators have documented what the reports describe as anomalous vitrification. Surfaces of brick or stone that appear fused or glazed in ways inconsistent with ordinary building fire or kiln firing. Vitrified material has been found at sites across the broader region. The official reports do not offer a consensus explanation for what produced it. The range of proposed causes includes military use of accelerants, intense conflagrations from stored organic material, and in a small number of cases, causes described in the literature as unresolved. Ash layers present a separate problem. Normal fire at a settlement site produces localized deposits consistent with the structures that burned. What appears at certain sites are ash deposits that are both spatially broad and chemically inconsistent with the fuel sources present on site. The ash arrives from somewhere. The excavation reports record the deposits without identifying their origin. At several sites, the depth of the ash layer is inconsistent with the quantity of organic material available at the site to produce it. The source remains unidentified in the published record. Abandoned sites without destruction evidence form a distinct archaeological category. A city does not simply stop. The cessation of urban activity at a settlement without a corresponding military event, epidemic signature, or identifiable environmental cause represents a research problem that Near Eastern archaeology has not fully resolved. Multiple sites within the Sumerian sphere of influence fall into this category. They were occupied, then they were not. No burning, no bodies, no weapons. The wells at some of these sites show elevated mineral content in the sediment layers associated with the final occupation period. The Sumerian King List records this pattern from above, at the administrative level. Cities appear in the list holding kingship. Then kingship is transferred. then the city that held it vanishes from the record entirely, not conquered by a named enemy, not absorbed into another polity, simply gone from the administrative geography of Mesopotamia. The list does not explain why. It records the transfer and moves on. The tablet's 7 notations map onto these categories: sky fire and vitrified brick, evil wind and abandonment without bodies, ash burial and anomalous ash deposits, floodwater and permanent inundation, sand burial and sites beneath desert dunes, bitter wells and elevated mineral content in final occupation layers, and one city that disappears from the record so completely that later scribes preserved only its name and a warning. These are not one-to-one equivalences. The archaeological record is incomplete. The tablet's damage means some notations are only partially readable, and the geographic specifics of which tablet city corresponds to which excavated site cannot be established with current evidence. What can be said is this: the physical categories the tablet uses correspond to physical phenomena that archaeologists have documented at real sites, and that those phenomena cluster in the same approximate period, the late 3rd millennium BCE, roughly 2200 to 2000 BCE, that the tablet appears to describe, not coincidence, pattern. The question this leaves open is one that the tablet does not attempt to answer, and that no subsequent Sumerian text addresses directly. What produces 7 different physical destruction signatures across a single region within a single historical window? Military campaigns produce consistent signatures. Drought produces a different consistent signature. Epidemic leaves its own markers. The diversity of endings in this tablet: fire from above, atmospheric displacement, ash, flood, sand, contamination, erasure, does not describe any single mechanism. It describes either a sequence of unrelated events occurring in the same window, or a single event complex producing different effects in different locations. The tablet names both possibilities and resolves neither. The scribes who preserved it appear to have faced the same interpretive problem. They preserved the record. They did not explain it. Consider what it meant to copy a text in Ur around 2000 BCE. The scribal schools, the aduba, the tablet houses, were not merely educational institutions. They were the memory infrastructure of a civilization. Every administrative record, every hymn, every mythological narrative existed in clay and only in clay, and clay is fragile. It cracks, it erodes, it dissolves in water. The only way to preserve what the clay held was to copy it onto new clay, before the old clay crumbled. This is what scribes did in the aftermath of Ur's fall. They sat in the rubble of their city and copied. Not because someone ordered them to, because the alternative was silence. There had to have been a young scribe, a student perhaps not yet fully trained, working in whatever remained of the aduba at Nippur or at Lagash in the years after the collapse, copying a text from a damaged original carried out of Ur before or just after the city fell. The original was already old when it arrived. The scribe could see that. The clay was a different colour, the stylus marks a different depth, the hand an older form of the cuneiform script. The text listed cities. The scribe would have known some of them: Ur, Nippur, Eridu, names that appeared in the King List. Others he would not have recognised. Names of cities that no living person could locate. Cities that the King List recorded holding kingship once, briefly, and then never again. The scribe copied anyway. The name he could not locate, he copied. The notation describing the ending of a city he had never heard of, he copied. And when he reached the 7th name, the one with the blank after it, the one with only the word that translated as warning, he copied that too. He made no marginal notation explaining the blank. He copied the blank and the warning, and moved on to the next text in the pile. This is how the tablet survived, not through institutional decision, through one person pressing one reed stylus into fresh clay, because the alternative was that the word stopped existing. The tablets that preserved the Sumerian Lament literature were excavated across multiple sites, over roughly a century of fieldwork. Significant collections came from Nippur, where American and European teams worked from the 1880s through the 20th century. Material from these excavations is now distributed across institutions, including the University Museum at the University of Pennsylvania, the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago, the British Museum in London, and the Iraq Museum in Baghdad. The tablets are catalogued. Many are photographed. Some have been digitized as part of the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature, which has made several thousand Sumerian texts searchable and readable online. The specific tablet I have been describing occupies an uncertain position in the existing catalogues, not because it has been suppressed or hidden, because the cataloguing of Mesopotamian tablets is an unfinished project, and the overlap between lamentation literature and administrative memory has not been a primary research focus. The tablet exists. It sits in a storage drawer in one of these institutions, or it has been digitized and waits in a database. The vitrified brick it describes is in museum storage at sites across the region. The gap in the record is not a gap in the physical evidence, it is a gap in the question. No scholar of Sumerian lamentation literature has sat down with this tablet and asked, if these 7 endings are physically specific rather than theologically interchangeable, what does the physical record show at the sites that correspond to each notation? The question has not been asked because the discipline that studies the tablets and the discipline that studies the physical sites operate largely in parallel. It is not that the answer has been found and suppressed. It is that the question is sitting in a storage drawer waiting for someone to open it. And I have to be honest, I cannot fully answer it either. What I can do is ask it. What I can do is point at the place where the record and the archive and the physical evidence converge and say, this question has not been formally put. There is still a name in the tablet that no scholar has matched to a known site, the 7th city, the one with only the warning. The Lament tradition preserved city names for a reason. The name was the city's identity, the thing that survived when everything physical was gone. When a city's name was preserved only as a warning, without any description of what had ended it, the preservation was both a record and an acknowledgement. We know this happened. We do not know what happened. We know it must not be forgotten. The scribes who copied that warning into fresh clay could not have known their work would survive 4,000 years in the ground, be excavated, translated, digitized, uploaded, and still not have had its central question formally asked. They copied because silence was the only alternative they could see. They could not see that the silence would come anyway later, not the silence of destroyed clay, but the silence of a question that sits inside an answer and waits. The tablet is still there. The ash layers are still in the ground. The 7th name is still in the corpus, preserved the way the scribes preserved it, intact, unresolved, carrying only the instruction to remember. The buildings remember even if we do not. The documents preserve what the encyclopedias never recorded. And somewhere in the catalogued collections of cuneiform tablets, held by institutions across 4 continents, in the careful line impressions of scribes who sat in the ruins of one world and copied words into another, the record of what ended those 7 cities is waiting. The same way it has been waiting for 4,000 years, for someone willing to ask what the last witnesses actually wrote, instead of assuming that poetry and catastrophe cannot occupy the same clay.